when the Berlin Wall fell, there was an American State Department official named Francis Fukuyama, and he wrote a very influential essay called The End of History. And for decades, capitalism was in a struggle with communism. And in his essay, Fukuyama argued that with the triumph of capitalism, we've come to the end of history, meaning we now know what humanity most strives for, which is a liberal consumer democracy, where people feel empowered to have the freedom to buy whatever they want. And this, for him, was the apex of human civilization. And this creates what is called the Unipolar Moment, where America is the global hegemon, and it creates a world that is heavily globalized, capitalistic, and very individualistic. And this is a very unique moment in human history. And we've come with this war in Iran to the end of this moment. All right? So let me first explain the three major characteristics of this unipolar moment. The first is what we call Pax Americana, where American power, American military might guarantee peace in the entire world. And this is unique in human history, where for the first time there was a power that was able to dominate the entire globe. And America was able to do so through three mechanisms, okay? The first is, of course, its military power, but specifically aerial supremacy, okay? Which is backed up by special forces and the CIA. So the CIA was able to infiltrate every single government in the world and identify who would be loyal to the American empire and then promote this person. If there were individuals that challenged the American empire, these people were demoted or eliminated. Nations that proved problematic, for example, maybe Syria or Libya, special forces went in to sabotage the economy, and then aerial power went in to destroy the government. And so this created Pax Americana. Now, what's good about this is that it did bring peace to very problematic regions. For example, in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, North Korea, China, Vietnam did not compete against each other. They just participated in the global economy, which brought tremendous wealth and prosperity to the East Asia region. This is true also in Europe and South America as well. Okay, so air supremacy. Then you have something called surveillance. And basically what I mean by that is the internet. So believe it or not, but the internet was created not to actually help you communicate and to watch pornography. It was actually to have a mass surveillance system over the entire human population, so that the Pentagon, the military, knew exactly the vibe or the culture, the attitudes, the emotions of each region. And through social media, through mechanisms such as Facebook and Twitter, they were able to manipulate certain emotions. Okay? So the second mechanism is mass surveillance through the popularization of the internet. And the third is something called a rules-based international order. Okay, and what this means is American power hid behind multilateral organizations such as the United Nations, such as the World Bank, such as the World Trade Organization. And so people didn't notice that the American empire was dominating everything. They believed that the world was fair and just, and through logic and reason and debate, they could present their case. All right? So for the longest time, this Pax Americana provided peace and stability to the world, which brought tremendous prosperity.
So to understand the crash, we first have to look at what exactly is crashing.
Exactly. We have to start at the foundation.
The lecture grounds this whole phenomenon in Francis Fukuyama's famous concept of the end of history.
Right, that post-Cold War mentality.
Yeah, if you remember the vibe after the Cold War, there was this supreme, almost arrogant confidence that humanity had reached its final evolutionary stage.
The liberal consumer democracy.
Yes, the idea that the ultimate goal of human existence was simply, having the freedom to buy whatever you wanted at a competitive price.
And that ideological confidence birthed what the source identifies as the Unipolar Moment.
Which is a pretty unique era.
It was a fleeting window where America was the undisputed global hegemon. But this wasn't just soft power. According to the lecture, this era was propped up by three very specific interlocking pillars.
Okay, lay them out for us.
The first was Pax Americana. But the source completely strips away the romanticism here.
Oh, yeah, they don't hold back.
Not at all. This wasn't a peace maintained by goodwill. It was enforced by aerial supremacy, carrier strike groups, and covert operations.
I mean, they specifically talk about the CIA actively infiltrating foreign governments, right?
Exactly. Promoting loyalists and systematically eliminating challengers to the dollar-based order.
And a huge part of that control apparatus, according to the source, was actually the internet.
Which is such a wild reframing.
Right. Because we have this collective nostalgia for the early internet. We view it as this beautiful, democratizing tool for human connection.
But the speaker argues its actual primary utility was mass surveillance.
Yes. That it evolved into a machine designed to monitor the global population in real time, to read the cultural vibe and actively manipulate human emotions through social media algorithms just to maintain systemic compliance.
Which seamlessly transitions into the second pillar, the supremacy of science.
All right, so that's number one. Number two is the supremacy of science. So for most of human history, people were religious. They believed in gods. But with the rise of Pax Americana, science became the dominant religion of the whole world. All right, so the classic example is COVID. COVID was raging across the world, and then they introduced vaccines. Now, I teach critical thinking skills. So when I first heard about vaccines, I was a bit skeptical. I said to my friends who are Chinese and American, I said, vaccines used to take about 10 years to develop. And that's when the virus is stable and have been around for centuries. But this COVID is constantly mutating, and they haven't have done enough trial research. So is it really safe to take these vaccines? And whether they were Chinese or American, their response was the same, which is, how dare you question science? You are a peasant. Have you gone to school? Have you no culture? Can you not think? Okay? And this shows you how science has become the new religion of the world. And if you think about it, the scientists that run the world, they're actually transnational priests. Okay? And science is an international brotherhood where if you're a scientist in China, you're not actually loyal to China. You're actually loyal to the international order of science, because that's how you get promoted, right? You get published in Nature or Science. If you win an award, like the Nobel Prize, that's how you get rewarded, okay? So you're better off being loyal to the brotherhood of science rather than your own nation state. And of course, it is the American empire that controls science.
Oh, this part was fascinating.
The lecture argues that during this unipolar era, science fundamentally mutated. It stopped being a rigorous, skeptical method of inquiry and calcified into this transnational, unquestionable religion.
And the example used in the lecture really crystallized this point. They pointed to the cultural reaction during the global rollout of the COVID vaccines.
Yeah, that was a huge moment of friction.
The speaker highlighted how anyone who expressed even baseline skepticism, someone who simply questioned the unprecedented speed of development for a rapidly mutating virus, they were immediately socially excommunicated.
Right. The mainstream response wasn't a debate.
Not at all. It was, how dare you question science?
And the source argues this proved that scientists had basically elevated themselves into a transnational priesthood.
A priesthood where their loyalty was no longer to the public or to any individual nation, but to an international brotherhood of peer-reviewed publications and grant money.
And the third unique aspect of the Unipolar Moment is, of course, the universality of the US dollar. And it's incredible to think about where just a piece of paper, you think it's gold, you think there's value in it. And not just you, but everyone around you. So that if you take your US dollars, you can go anywhere in the world and buy yourself a villa, or enjoy a nice vacation, or fly around. But not only that, but you aspire in life to accumulate as much US dollars as possible, right? Is there really a difference between $100 million and $100 billion? There's actually no difference. You can't spend it. But you want to achieve as much as possible, and as a result, you focus your entire life on accumulating as much as possible. Okay? So these are the three main pillars of the unipolar movement. And again, in the beginning, which was maybe the early 90s, this led to tremendous peace and prosperity throughout the world. The problem, though, is that over time, these three pillars started to decay, right? So, Pax Americana started to itself ignore the rules-based international order, which itself created, right? So America started to bomb countries such as Libya and Syria without international approval. Most recently, it went to attack Iran without even asking for the opinion of the world, without even caring what the world thought, okay? So this leads to the idea of hubris. Maybe the first generation appreciates the importance of collaboration, of consensus. But the second generation, the children, are arrogant. They have hubris. They want to enjoy their power. Okay? So that's problem number one. Supremacy of science, religion, basically it becomes a religion in itself, orthodoxy. So that science does not become the main engine of innovation in the world, it becomes the main engine of orthodoxy or suppression. And that's why for the past 20, 30 years, we've seen very little in terms of technological innovation. Don't tell me Silicon Valley is the center of innovation in the world, okay? All they do is make food delivery apps. It's been a long time since we've seen massive innovation in the world. What we've seen these past 20, 30 years is the scaling out, the popularization of innovation, right? Where American technology is spread throughout the world, especially in China. But we have not seen actually major innovation in science itself, right? And the third thing, the university of the US dollar leads to printing dollars, okay? Or just basically corruption. Where because America is able to print as much US dollars as it wants to fund its corruption, it does so, okay? So the US dollar has lessened in value. And what this means is basically it's made inequality worse, it's made corruption worse, it's made people very lazy. If you're a young person, you're like, you know what, no matter how hard I work, I'm still screwed in the end because the boomers, the older generation, have so much more money than I do. I can never catch up. So I refuse to play this game. Either I refuse to play this game, so I quit, pumping, lie flat, or I gamble. I pray that if I put $1 million in Bitcoin, it'll go up to $10 million, or the stock market, or sports betting, okay? That's why in America, gambling has become so popular. All right? So this has led to today, basically.
And finally, the third pillar holding up this unipolar moment is the universality of the US dollar.
The ultimate pursuit of wealth.
Exactly. The collective global hallucination that this specific green paper held supreme value is what allowed the entire intricate web of global supply chains to function.
But the central diagnostic of this lecture is that all three of these pillars haven't just weakened. They have terminally decayed.
Yeah, the rot is all the way through.
When I was reading through the source, trying to visualize this decay, this analogy hit me.
Oh, Let's hear it.
It feels exactly like a mandatory smartphone operating system that the entire world was forced to install 30 years ago.
Okay, I like where this is going.
In the beginning, it was revolutionary. The interface was clean, global trade loaded incredibly fast, everyone was connected. But over the decades, the developers got arrogant.
They stopped pushing security updates.
Exactly. And they just started mining crypto in the background to enrich themselves. The battery drain we're all feeling right now isn't an accident or a glitch. It's a feature of the new extraction model.
That is an incredibly accurate way to map the source's argument. The hubris you mentioned is exactly what eroded Pax Americana.
Because they just stopped caring about diplomacy.
Right. The source points to the foreign policy interventions of the last 20 years, places like Libya, Syria, and the posturing around Iran.
Done without international consensus.
Exactly. It was a classic case of second-generation arrogance. The inheritors of the empire wanted to exercise maximum power without respecting the subtle rules their predecessors used to build the system in the first place.
And the science pillar, it completely stalled out into this defensive orthodoxy.
The innovation just stopped.
Yeah, the lecturer makes this biting critique that we haven't seen true paradigm-shifting physical innovation in decades. Instead of curing complex diseases or engineering a post-scarcity energy grid, Silicon Valley took our brightest minds and just had them build algorithmic food delivery apps.
We scaled old technology to maximize convenience rather than creating anything fundamentally new.
Exactly. And then the decay of the US dollar pillar is perhaps the most visceral for you, the listener, right now.
Oh, absolutely. The inflation is undeniable.
The source argues that endless money printing, which was necessary to fund the bloated structures of this unipolar system, has absolutely devastated the purchasing power of the currency. It's engineered a massive wealth gap.
And the social fallout of that economic reality is everywhere.
You look at the youth demographics today, and they just feel entirely alienated.
Because they're locked out of the system.
Right. They look at the asset prices held by the older generation and realize no amount of traditional hard work will ever let them catch up. So according to the source, they react in two distinct ways.
They either drop out or they gamble.
Exactly. They either quiet quit, the lie flat movement, where they simply refuse to participate in the traditional economy, or they gamble with terrifying desperation.
Throwing whatever meager savings they have into highly volatile crypto coins.
Or sports betting apps on their phones. Just praying for a miracle payout because the traditional ladder of upward mobility has been totally pulled up.
It is a profound systemic cultural rot.
All right? So, we shouldn't see this war against Iran as just a decision of one person, Donald Trump, or the machinations of a country, Israel. Really, this war in Iran is happening because we've come to the end of the Unipolar Moment, because the American empire has become corrupt, self-indulgent, lazy, arrogant. All right? So, with the end of the American empire, with the end of Pax Americana, we are shifting towards a new world. And this new world, some will survive, most will not. Okay? And this is true throughout history, where when the empire declines and the world order is shifting, where there's a paradigm shift, people are forced to make a hard choice of either adapt or die. All right? So let me show you how the world needs to change if it is to survive. Basically, what has to happen is we have to move from an emphasis on efficiency to resilience. Okay? That is the main goal in the future. Today, it's really about how to make things as cheap as possible and get it to as many people as quickly as possible to make as much money as possible, okay? The idea of efficiency. Generating as much profit as possible. The idea of resilience is to appreciate that there will be a series of crises, and what you need to do is focus on adapting and surviving these crises, okay? So for a nation, for a community to survive in the future, there has to be three major changes. And if you're able to make these three major changes, you will survive. If you do not make these changes, you will be eliminated, okay? It will be survival of the fittest.
But, and this is crucial, the cultural decay of the unipolar moment is only the superficial layer.
It gets worse.
It gets much worse. The physical foundation of this global empire is incredibly fragile, and that brings us to the actual trigger for the coming collapse.
The definitive end of cheap. Precisely. Because the entire unipolar world order, every single modern convenience we enjoy, is entirely predicated on the uninterrupted flow of cheap petroleum. It's crazy when you really think about it. The speaker literally asks the audience to look around the room.
Yeah, everything is oil.
Everything. The synthetic fibers in your clothes, the sterile plastics in your medicine, the components in your computer, and most importantly, the ammonia-based fertilizer that grows the food you eat. It is all either powered by or directly manufactured from cheap oil.
And this assumption of cheap energy engineered a very specific, highly complex, and now failing economic loop.
How did that loop actually work?
Well, for decades, the engine of the global economy was Middle Eastern oil, specifically from the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council.
Okay.
The consolidated petro-wealth of the Gulf fueled China's explosive industrialization. China bought that cheap energy, built endless megafactories, sprawling malls, and towering skylines.
Generating unprecedented national wealth in the process.
Right. And then that surplus wealth from both the GCC and China was continuously recycled back into the global system.
Buying American debt and funding Western infrastructure. I see.
But the source makes it painfully clear, if that specific loop breaks, the global economy essentially stops breathing.
And what's truly terrifying is how utterly oblivious we are to our physical vulnerabilities.
Oh, we are completely blind to it.
We treat the cloud as this decentralized, invincible ether floating above us, totally immune to the physical world.
When in reality, it is a brutally fragile choke point. The internet isn't magic. The cloud is nothing more than a physical network of deeply vulnerable undersea cables.
And they can be cut.
Very easily. The source presents a highly plausible, chilling scenario. A localized geopolitical conflict, say, a kinetic war involving Iran and the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, could easily sever those vital cables.
Wow. What happens then?
We're talking about instantly losing internet access for 20 to 30% of the global population across Africa, India, and the Middle East.
Just gone in a second.
But the catastrophe wouldn't just be losing social media. It would mean the instant evaporation of the cloud-based global financial system. The ledger of who owns what would simply vanish in those regions.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The source uses commercial air travel as the ultimate glaring symbol of this fragile era.
Yeah, air travel is the perfect metric for this.
Think about the mechanics of it. In 1950, flying across the globe was an incredibly rare luxury reserved for millionaires and diplomats.
It was an event.
Today, you can pull a piece of glass out of your pocket, tap a few buttons, and physically fly across the planet by tomorrow morning for a few $100s.
And we've just normalized this.
We think it's a permanent human right, but the source firmly warns that this is a historical anomaly. The era of cheap vacations and easy global movement is about to completely vanish as energy constraints tighten.
So if the era of hyperglobalization is over, this raises an urgent question.
How do we survive it?
Exactly. If the system of efficiency, making things as cheap and fast as possible for maximum corporate profit, is dying, how do nations actually survive the incoming crash?
Right.
The speaker argues they must completely abandon efficiency and pivot to a model of resilience.
Because a resilient society doesn't care about quarterly profits.
No, it cares about surviving the absolute worst-case supply chain disruptions.
And to achieve that resilience, the source outlines 3 mandatory, brutal shifts that every surviving nation has to force upon its population.
These are tough pills to swallow.
All right, so the first thing you need to do is move from materialism to spirituality. Right now, the entire world, these nation states, have convinced the population what matters is your material well-being. If you are driving a car, if you have a house, if you have enough food to eat, then you should shut up and obey because we're doing a good job. Okay? But in the future, governments can't do that because there are not enough resources to go around. Therefore, the government has to make you believe that what matters is your happiness, your well-being, your spirituality. And that usually means a renewed focus on religion. Okay? That's the first thing. Second thing is to move from a system of individuality to community and family. All right, and what this means is today what you're taught in school, what you're taught in society is what matters is you, me, okay? The ego. If it's doing well for me, it's good. I don't actually care about other people. In the future, you have to focus on building a community, on helping others. Okay? And the last major shift is from the old to the young. Okay? And this is very simple, and this is actually the hardest thing to do, which is like today, most countries, especially the wealthy Western industrial nations, are controlled by the baby boomers, the elderly, the gerontocracy. They have all the money, they have all the power, but for society to thrive in the future, this power needs to shift to a younger generation, ideally maybe in the 30s, okay? The younger the better. And you think this is easy to do, it's not. Because first of all, these baby boomers have access to the best healthcare in the world, they have a lot of money, and they really enjoy living, and they're also really selfish, okay? So this is actually the hardest problem to solve for most Western societies. How do you transfer power from the old to the young? And quite honestly, historically, we've never ever faced this problem before. Never. Because the old simply don't live that long, okay? Now, baby boomers are living to at least 100 years old. So they have another 20 years ahead of them in power. Meanwhile, the young cannot develop the experience and expertise in order to lead the nation. So whichever nation actually figures out this problem first, how do you give the old and give power to the young, then will most likely thrive in the new world that's coming. And if you were to ask me which nation would most likely achieve this first, I would say Japan. And the reason is very simple. Because in Japan, this problem is the most pressing. They are the eldest population. They have the oldest population in the world. And so they need to resolve this issue really, really quickly. Okay? And maybe in the next 5-10 years, and I think that Japan will actually resolve this issue. But it may be the only nation that's able to resolve this issue because it's so difficult. You love your grandparents. Do you want to see your grandparents die? Of course not. Okay, you're going against human biological nature. All right. So that's the main argument I want to make you today. Okay.
First, a shift from materialism to spirituality or religion.
Because governments will no longer have the resources to buy citizens' compliance with material goods.
Exactly. When they can't buy you off with cheap flat-screen TVs, they need you to find meaning internally, or society tears itself apart.
Right. And the second shift?
A shift from individuality to community and family. The hyper-individualistic, ego-driven attitude of the West has to die, so local communities can physically rely on each other for basic survival.
Makes sense.
And third, a massive voluntary transfer of power from the old to the young.
Ah, yes. The generational bottleneck.
Now, hold on. I have to push back on this on behalf of anyone listening right now. How is that power transfer practically going to happen without extreme violence?
It's a massive hurdle.
The source itself explicitly notes that the baby boomer generation holds almost all the consolidated wealth. They have access to the best health care, they live to be 90 or 100 years old, and frankly, the speaker characterizes them as an incredibly self-interested generation.
Yes, they do.
Why on earth would they ever just voluntarily hand over the keys to the economy and government to a bunch of 30-somethings?
That is the exact paradox the source highlights. Historically, this generational tension wasn't an issue because human beings simply didn't live long enough to hoard power for decades past their prime.
Right, biology used to force the transfer.
Exactly. But today, modern medicine has created a massive, unprecedented generational bottleneck. The speaker believes that in almost every Western nation, the elderly will absolutely refuse to let go of their assets and political influence.
Which will inevitably lead to deep civil chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. However, they point to one fascinating outlier, Japan.
Oh, right, Japan. Because their demographics are so skewed, they have the oldest population in the world, so they're hitting this crisis before anyone else.
Exactly. The source theorizes that Japan might be the absolute only nation on Earth equipped to survive this bottleneck, and it comes down to sociology.
How so?
In the West, the cultural philosophy is largely individual maximization. But in Japan, there is a profound, deeply ingrained cultural philosophy of duty to the continuous thread of the nation.
Wow. So you're saying,
The source argues that Japanese elders might actually voluntarily step down, liquidate their hoarded assets, and transfer institutional power to the younger generations.
driven by a moral obligation.
Exactly. To ensure the survival of the collective over their own individual comfort. Everywhere else, failing to make that cultural leap will result in a brutal reality.
And the reality the source paints for the nations that fail to transition is incredibly grim. It starts with what the lecture calls the trap of megacities.
Places with over 10 or 20 million people.
Right, largely concentrated in India and China. Globalization built these cities, treating them as hyper-efficient labor hubs. But in a world of fractured supply chains, they are absolute death traps.
You cannot feed 20 million people surrounded by concrete.
You just can't. The speaker argues humanity has to radically decentralize. We will be forced to abandon these urban centers and move back to the countryside simply to cultivate enough food to survive.
Because the global food supply is the most terrifying domino waiting to fall. The agricultural output of the global south relies almost entirely on synthetic fertilizer produced in the global north.
Using ammonia and petroleum.
Right. And when global trade routes fracture, that fertilizer simply stops flowing southward. The source doesn't sugarcoat this. Without that chemical input, the arable land on this planet cannot sustain 8 billion human beings.
The math is horrifying. A sudden deficit in global calories inevitably triggers desperate resource wars, cascading famines, and localized genocides.
Which sparks a secondary crisis.
Yes, an unprecedented wave of global migration. Millions of people fleeing conflict and starvation in the global south will push violently toward the perceived safety of North America and Europe.
But here is the twisted, deeply cynical irony the source points out.
Oh, I know where this is going.
Those aging populations in the global north, the exact same demographic, hoarding the wealth and refusing to give up political power, they actually need that desperate incoming immigrant labor.
Because their own kids won't do the hard labor.
Exactly. They need people to mow their lawns, physically deliver their food, and bathe them in care facilities because their own disenfranchised younger generations simply refuse to participate.
So you have this combustible scenario. The North relies entirely on this continuous influx of cheap labor just to maintain basic services.
But that very influx sparks intense cultural friction and civil conflict.
Because the native populations feel their cultural identity is being erased. It is a mathematical no-win scenario that guarantees decades of domestic instability.
What's fascinating here is how the source predicts the macroeconomic response to all of this chaos. It's a massive historical reversion.
Right, globalization dies.
The frictionless, free trade globalization we know will completely shatter, and the world will revert to a 16th century style of mercantilism.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at how the world is going to transform because of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, because of this war in Iran. Okay, all right. So basically we're in a new world because our world today is built entirely on access to cheap petroleum products, cheap energy, right? Why are you allowed to be in school learning from me rather than the fields farming? Because of energy, right? Because of oil from the Middle East. Your computer is based on what? Petroleum. This camera that's filming me is based on what? Petroleum. This pen, petroleum. This clothing, petroleum. The medicine you eat, petroleum. The food that you eat comes from fertilizers, which is based also on petroleum. So basically, everything in this room, everything in the world is based on cheap petroleum. The entire global economy, the main foundation is cheap petroleum. So what happens in a world where petroleum is already cheap? Well, now you need a massive rebalancing in the world, okay? The other thing about the world is, this is the GCC countries, okay? The Middle East countries. And as you can see, this is really important to see is, around the year 2005, they started to have massive account surplus, meaning they were selling so much oil, they couldn't really spend all their money. Do you guys know why? Why was this happening? What happened in 2005, 2004 that made these countries extremely wealthy? All right, China, okay? Think about it. What's China doing? Well, China in the 80s and 90s was putting factories, right? But then China itself developed this account surplus, so now China wants to develop its industrial base, right? And how do you do that? By importing oil from the GCC, right? And that's why we have these skyscrapers, these malls, these roads, okay? Because China was able to import all this cheap oil from the GCC. And then the GCC would take this money, okay? And then invest it back into the American stock market. But not just that, but they would invest it in Africa. They would invest in infrastructure. So for the longest time, the Chinese economy and the GCC are the two main pillars of the entire global economy. Okay? And what this means is that if the GCC no longer is able to export oil, this is going to have a major impact on China. And together, the two are going to have a major impact on the global economy. Okay? Basically, the global economy is dead. All right. Okay, another thing that you may not be aware of is today, flying around the world, it's very, very simple to do. You get if you want it, what we can do now is get our mobiles out, go to the website, and look at where we're going to fly to, and then book that flight for tonight. Pay using a credit card, take a taxi to the airport, get on a flight, and we're there the next morning. That's really, really impressive. Guess what, guys? You couldn't do this 20 years ago. Okay? The technology was around, but it was not widely available. Now look at this, where the entire world is interconnected. Okay? This is a pretty stark chart where in 1950, it was considered a tremendous luxury to fly. You had to be a millionaire, basically, to want to fly for vacation, okay? Everyone else just drove their car. Now, it's like anyone can drive. And again, this happened just in the past, basically, 30, 40 years. And this, of course, is because of Pax Americana, where Pax Americana will guarantee there's no conflict in the world, and therefore, planes can just fly around. Otherwise, you'd be shut down. Okay? All right. Well, this world is coming to an end. In the future, flights will be very expensive, and vacations will be unaffordable. Okay? All right. This is the internet, guys. Yeah, you don't know this. You think that the internet is just that you go on the computer and then boom, the internet is there. No, actually, the internet is undersea cables that connect the entire world. And unfortunately, there's a war going on right here, guys. And unfortunately, it's really easy for Iran to cut off the undersea cables, which would lead to internet disruption for maybe 20-30% of the world. Okay? Africa, Northern Africa, India, the Middle East, maybe parts of Europe will lose internet access. You think, okay, well that's fine. They just won't watch Netflix anymore. No, guys, okay? The entire global economy is based off the cloud. So if you want to bank, if you want basically finance, okay? So this is going to have a huge impact in the world. And this can happen anytime, where for the reason there's a war going on in the Strait of Hormuz, some cables get cut off, and then suddenly you've lost internet access. And this would basically cause major disruptions throughout the world. All right. Okay. So one thing that you notice about this world is the sheer amount of population growth, where after World War II, because of Pax Americana, you see a massive boom in population. And unfortunately, this is not sustainable. It is not possible for the planet to sustain 8 billion people. many of whom want to fly around the world every twice a year, who want to drive an SUV, who want to have food, who want to have avocados every single day. They want to have like cherries every single day, okay? So this population growth is not sustainable. And basically what happens is this: when you are too off balance, when there's a correction, the correction is pretty extreme, okay? So this chart by itself, the fact that we have so many people, means like if there's a crisis, the population will see a massive shrinkage, okay? You're like, okay, how? And the answer is food scarcity. Food is today pretty common, but food is based on global trade, okay? So let me show you what I mean by this. All right, so the yellow, okay, are places that need fertilizer to grow food, meaning their land is not good for farming, so they need fertilizer to grow food. They also have a large population. And as you can see, a lot of this is based in Africa and maybe Central Asia and parts of South America. Ammonia is a chemical produced from oil to petroleum that is fundamental for fertilizers. And as you can see, this is mainly in the north of the world. And what allows for 8 billion people is the fact that the north is able to export fertilizer to the south. And that's it, guys. You understand? If this were to stop for whatever reason, people in the south would be in a lot of trouble. All right? So as you can see, this trade in fertilizer is what sustains a global population of 8 billion people. Again, if there's a disruption to this trade, the people in the south are in a lot of trouble. All right. So, if you're in the green, you're okay? But if you are in the red, you are in a lot of trouble, okay? You are in a lot of trouble if you are in the red. But honestly, if you are not in the green, you could still be in a lot of trouble, because again, what we're looking for is resilience. The idea of efficiency is, let's imagine the best case scenario and try to make as much money out of it as possible, okay? The idea of resilience is, let's imagine the worst case scenario and see if we can survive it. Basically, if you have food security issues, you are facing a massive problem, okay? Because again, we're imagining the worst case scenario. And again, I hate to say this, but if you're not in the green, you should be worrying right now, okay? And where's China? Not in the green, guys, okay? It's something that national leaders in the world have to start thinking about right now, food scarcity. All right, water. Again, the countries that suffer from food scarcity, some of them also suffer from food scarcity, okay? From water scarcity. Okay, all right, forget this. All right, okay, so basically this area is in a lot of trouble. I would say that water is far more problematic than food. And again, I hate to say this, but if you are any country here, what's going on here? If you're any country in this area, okay, you should be worried. Freedom is a very important issue because freedom is actually important for resilience issues, okay? And what this means is that when there's a crisis, leaders and the population need to collectively make sacrifices. But when there's very little freedom, meaning there's very little transparency and accountability, where the public don't have access to the leadership, then the leadership could possibly make selfish, self-defeating decisions. And the public is not involved, and therefore the public refuses to make the sacrifices necessary in order to make the nation survive, okay? And so this leads to conflict around the world. And again, countries that suffer the most from food issues and water issues also are most likely to come into conflict with other people, okay? So this is a map of nations at war. The red means that they are at war, okay? And you can see Africa and the Middle East is especially under a lot of conflict, a lot of stress, while at the same time they're suffering from food scarcity and water issues, right? So what you will see, another issue I want to bring up is the idea of megacities. And the idea of megacities is any cities that have over 10 million people. And you think, wow, like spaces are amazing because you have like shopping malls and you have like skyscrapers. That's great. No, guys. Megacities are really bad. Okay? Megacities should not exist. They exist because of globalization. Because what megacities do is they're able to bring in a lot of people, have them specialize in a particular area, make it industrial, and then export it to the rest of the world. Okay? And where are most megacities located? Well, they're located in India and in China. This is a problem because India and China both suffer from food and water issues. If you are to be resilient, you actually want most of your population not in cities, but in the countryside growing food. Because first of all, they are self-sufficient. Second of all, you will have a food supply. Unfortunately, right now, China imports a quarter of its food. And also remember, food also requires energy to grow, right? So China imports 75% of its oil. This brings up the question of how resilient is China? Okay, but not just China, but also any big country with a megacity, or too many megacities, India specifically, will face problems in the future. Again, if you're a national leader, you should be worried right now, okay? All right. So, with this war and with disruptions to global trade, we should expect massive instability in nations that are not very resilient, okay? That have very little freedom, that have food issues, and which have water issues, okay? And so you would see revolutions, you would see wars, you would see famines, which leads to what? Which leads to massive migration, okay? And so these are trends. These are migration trends that we're already seeing where people from Africa, Middle East are moving to Europe, and people from South America and Latin America are moving to the United States, okay? And we should expect these trends to not only continue, but to accelerate by maybe 100 times, okay? And you think to yourself, okay, well, what Europe and North America can do is just build walls, right? They should right now build a wall because you're going to see a massive influx of refugees due to food and water issues. And unfortunately, Europe and North America have a huge problem. And the problem, of course, is aging, okay? So in 2020, the countries in purple are countries that have a significant elderly population. And this is 2050, where the entire Northern Hemisphere will have a significant elderly population. So the North, the industrial economies are aging very rapidly, which means their only option is to bring in cheap, desperate workers from the South who are fleeing conflict zones in order to run their economies. right? The problem of this, of course, is that this will lead to cultural conflict where the local populations, native populations, will feel they're being replaced by these refugees and these immigrants. And this will probably lead to civil conflict within North America and within Europe. Okay? And unfortunately, there's really no way around this issue because the elderly are in control and they want people to mow their lawns. They want people to nurse them. They want people to deliver food to them. And unfortunately, young people don't have to do that because their parents have money. Okay? So the only way around this issue is by importing cheap immigrant labor. Right? Okay. With the end of Pax Americana, what you will see emerge is regional trading blocks. Basically the idea of mercantilism, okay? Mercantilism. And for most of human history, this was what we did, where there was no one power that controlled the entire world. What happened was that maybe you had a local hegemon which guaranteed trade among its allies, okay? And you didn't trade with other people, you only traded within your regional trading bloc. And that's the world we're heading back towards, okay? So this is a map of the 16th century, 17th century, where, you have these mercantile empires, like the British, the Portuguese, the French, the Spanish, and they had their own trade networks. And they refused to work with each other, but the system worked fine, okay? It was more expensive, it was not so convenient, but it still works. So this does not mean the end of global trade, it just means much more limited global trade, right? Another thing that you will notice about the Asian economies is slaves were a very important part of the trade. And the reason why is this. You need energy to run society. Today we use oil. Back then they used human beings, right? You can no longer have access to cheap oil. What you do is you enslave people. And that's the way historically we've done things, all right? Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is religion. Because remember, the idea of resilience is you need people to focus more on spirituality and less on materialism. Because if they focus on materialism, their lives are getting worse and worse. Okay, so you need to cause a national spiritual rejuvenation in your country. And if you are in the gray, you might have issues. Okay, why? Because your people are not religious and too materialistic. And unfortunately, East Asia, okay, Japan, China, Korea, Vietnam are especially non-religious. That's going to be a problem for them in the future, okay? All right, so let's just summarize what we've learned so far. What are some major trends that we should expect over the next 10, 20 years? Again, I just say this, all right? If you really believe that next week, Donald Trump and Iran are going to come to a peace agreement, if you believe that maybe in 5-6 months, both Iran and the United States will exhaust themselves, the global economy will suffer too much, and then they'll just stop the war, and things will go back to normal. I don't know what to tell you, okay? You're living in a fantasy world. You have to wake up and recognize that this is the end of the unipolar moment, and we're moving towards a new world. And you can either choose to adapt to this new world, or you will die. It's that simple. All right? So, massive trend is deindustrialization and deurbanization, where people in the cities will have to move back to the countryside, especially young people. Okay? They have to learn like real skills. No more cryptocurrency trading for you guys, okay? Learn how to milk a cow or kill a chicken, or grow food, whatever, okay? But just do something useful for your life. Nationalism and remilitarization is very important, where you have to get young people who willing to fight and defend your land. Okay? And that means getting them to believe that your nation deserves to be strong. So whichever nations are most ready and most able to excite their younger population into fighting wars will be the ones who will be most resilient. Mercantile systems, basically independent trading blocks. Resource wars is a very big thing, okay? Famines, genocides, slavery. Okay? So remember, throughout most of human history, humans were the cheap energy. If you don't have access to cheap oil, well, then you're going to enslave human beings. All right? This is not a pretty future, but it is a future that could happen, and you have to mentally prepare yourself for this possibility. Okay? Mass migration, where people in the South are most likely to suffer from resource wars over water and food and people, so they try to escape to Europe and North America. Okay? Revolution, civil wars, and political instability in North America and in Europe because the baby boomers refuse to retire from the scene. And these are aging populations, massive inequality, massive corruption, massive stagnancy. And so this will lead to chaos in the streets, okay? Religion is a big thing. If you are not religious, I actually recommend looking into the possibility of becoming a religion, okay? It's going to be very useful for what's going to happen later on. These are things I will talk about more in the future, okay? But I will bring them up now. Like, how do I see the world in 10, 20 years' time, all right? So I will say this. I think that there will be eventually an alliance between Russia and Germany in Europe. Maybe for the next 5, 10 years, Germany and Russia will go to war against each other, but eventually what the two will figure out is they're better off actually working together than fighting against each other. Okay? You have Pax Americana. Remember, the entire point of this war in Iran, from Israel's perspective, is to knock out America from the Middle East and establish itself as the local hegemon. And then it becomes Pax Judaica. Okay? So I think Israel will come to dominate the Middle East. But then you're like, what about Iran? Okay, and like, I know it's hard to understand, but if the United States were to leave the scene and Israel and Iran had to go to war against each other, what would happen is they would say, why? Because Israel is like, I don't want Persia. And then Iran is like, I don't want Israel. And Israel has nuclear weapons. So they would agree to split the Middle East up where Iran controls Strait of Hormuz and Israel controls the Levant, right? Historically, actually, the Israelis, the Jewish people, they hated the Greeks, they hated the Romans, but they actually thought they had the Persians. So there's this history going back where Persians and Jews actually get along very well. And in fact, in the Middle East, the place outside Israel with the largest Jewish population is Iran. And they're very well treated there. Okay, so I don't see why, if America were to leave the scene, why couldn't Israel and Iran come to a mutually satisfactory agreement that benefits both nations? Right? Japan. Again, I think the major problem facing all Western industrial nations is the aging crisis. What do you do with these people who are 90 years old? They can't get out of the house. Their brains aren't really functioning properly, but they still control all the money, all the power, and they're extremely influential. What do you do? Well, in most countries, you can't do anything about it. But Japan is a very special country where the elderly have a moral obligation to the nation, to the people. So it could be a situation where Japan is in a lot of trouble and the elderly voluntarily choose to exit power and give it to the young. All right? But I think Japan's the only nation that would do this voluntarily. Every other nation, basically, there has to be wars in order for the young to arise to power.
So we're talking about deeply isolated, heavily fortified regional trading blocs. You only trade with your explicit military allies.
It's vastly more expensive, the goods are lower quality, but the supply chain is physically secure.
But the historical reversion gets much darker than just trade tariffs. The source explicitly predicts the actual literal return of slavery to the global economy.
Yeah, that part was a lot to process.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Slavery. In the 21st century, how does the source even begin to justify that economically when we have automated machinery, tractors, and solar panels? That just feels incredibly dramatic.
It sounds shocking, but the expert grounds it in cold, brutal economic logic.
Okay, explain that.
Tractors require refined diesel, right? And advanced solar arrays require highly complex international supply chains for rare earth metals.
Right, which are now broken.
Exactly. If those supply chains break down and cheap energy evaporates, the work still has to be done to keep the elite classes comfortable.
Oh, wow.
For the vast majority of human history, when societies lacked access to dense, cheap energy like oil or coal, human muscle was the default substitute.
That is chilling.
The source argues that as energy becomes scarce, human beings will once again be subjugated and commodified to serve as the cheap energy alternative to run agricultural and industrial economies.
It is a terrifying mechanism to think about, but the speaker presents it as an unavoidable historical rhythm.
Unfortunately, yes.
So, as the dust eventually settles on this chaotic period of deindustrialization, mass famine, and fractured trade, what do the new empires actually look like?
The source makes some highly specific, almost jarring predictions for the new geopolitical map.
Let's start with Europe. The speaker predicts a definitive future alliance between Russia and Germany.
Now, looking at the news today, that sounds absurd.
Totally absurd.
But the source argues that over the next decade, once the American security umbrella is fully withdrawn from Europe, sheer geography and resource needs will dictate their integration.
Because Germany needs the raw materials.
Exactly. Germany's massive industrial base cannot physically survive without cheap, accessible energy, and Russia cannot modernize its infrastructure without European manufacturing tech.
So they'll realize their mutual economic survival depends on a united bloc, completely overriding current political hostilities.
And then there's the Middle East, which the source fascinatingly dubs Pax Americana.
The argument here is that if America completely packs up and withdraws its military presence from the region, Israel and Iran will look across the map at each other.
And realize they have no fundamental existential desire to conquer one another's physical territory.
Right. They don't actually want each other's land.
And because both sides possess, or will possess, mutually assured nuclear deterrence, the source predicts they will reach a pragmatic, cold-blooded agreement to simply bifurcate the Middle East.
How does that split work?
Israel would consolidate control over the Levant and the Mediterranean coast, and Iran would achieve uncontested hegemony over the Persian sphere.
And the source even points out that historically, going back to antiquity, the Persians and the Jews actually had strong diplomatic ties.
Right. They functioned well as regional counterbalances, suggesting this division is deeply historically grounded.
Moving beyond physical geography, the source also predicts the rise of a new governance model they call techno-Marxism. How exactly does that function day to day?
It is born out of extreme resource scarcity. Certain nations will utilize the architecture of the surveillance state, AI monitoring, digital currencies, and facial recognition.
But not just for security, right?
No, to strictly control and distribute whatever limited resources remain. It is an algorithmic allocation of calories and energy based on your social utility.
Wow.
This will engineer a stark, brutal class division. A tiny technocratic elite living with relative freedom, and a massive underclass reduced to hyper-monitored serfs, told exactly what they can consume and when.
Which brings us to the United States.
All right, the American Holy Empire. The nation that is most capable of surviving the next few decades of tribulation, of crisis, is America. Why? Because America is so incredibly wealthy, okay? It's protected by 2 oceans. It really controls Canada and Mexico. So think of America as not just the continent of America, but really as the entire North American and Latin American, okay? That entire sphere is basically America. So it has unlimited resources, it has unlimited population. And also America, the Americans are the most creative, the most entrepreneurial, the most energetic people in the world. So I would bet against America, all right? But what I think will happen is that America will need a new identity in order to survive the age of tribulation. They will go from Pax Americana, which is a secular, global idea, to one that is much more nationalistic, that is more focused on community and nation. That means embracing Christianity. Okay? And I think that Christianity will be the force that rebuilds America after the many crises America will face over the next few years. The last thing that will happen is techno-Marxism, okay? Where nations that have the resources want to institute an AI surveillance state to better marshal the limited resources, to basically to better control its people. Okay? And this is something we'll talk about later on, okay? But basically, you will have this sharp division of people into different classes, where at the very top you have freedom, but people at the very bottom become slaves or serfs, right? Okay, so that is it for trends I see in the future. Again, I can say this, but you have to give the illusion that this war will end soon, and that once this war ends, then we'll go back to the things before this war, okay? No, the world has completely changed. We're not going back to the old world. We're going to a new world. And what this new world will look like is something that we can choose to control, okay?
Despite all this doom, the source predicts America will not only survive, but will transform into an entity they call the American Holy Empire.
And the logic here makes sense geographically.
Because of its massive internal agricultural resources, its unassailable ocean borders, and its total dominance over the Western Hemisphere.
Exactly. America has the physical foundation to endure the collapse of global trade. But the internal cultural shift required to survive will be massive.
What kind of shift?
The source claims that to endure the immense social friction of this economic contraction, America will completely shed its current secular, pluralistic, globalist identity.
Really? Why?
Because secular globalism requires material abundance to keep people happy. In an era of scarcity, the state will need a transcendent narrative to maintain order.
So it transforms into a fiercely nationalistic, deeply Christian empire, using religion as the unifying authoritarian force to rebuild.
That's the prediction. But even as the speaker meticulously lays out these specific predictions from Pax Americana to the American Holy Empire, they offer one crucial, overarching warning.
Do not get comfortable with any of these labels.
Right, because geopolitics will enter a state of constant, violent, dynamic flux.
The speaker explicitly compares the coming era to China's ancient warring states period, or the volatile shifting alliances of Europe in the 1930s.
A nation might ally with a neighbor to contain a mutual threat one year, and turn around and invade that same ally the very next year when resource needs shift.
Everything you thought you understood about permanent global alliances will be entirely obsolete.
So what does this all mean for us? If we synthesize the core message of this entire deep dive, it is an aggressive, stark wake-up call.
A huge wake-up call.
The source is demanding that we recognize the unipolar moment, this incredible era of cheap imported goods, easy international travel, and relative global peace was just a brief historical blip.
It's urging you to wake up from the comforting fantasy world that current international conflicts will just neatly resolve themselves at a peace conference and things will go back to the 2010s normal.
The mandate from the source is crystal clear. Adapt your mindset to a world of fierce scarcity and physical resilience, or face systemic elimination.
It is a framework that forces you to ruthlessly audit your own dependencies. It challenges every assumption we make about the infrastructure that keeps us alive.
It really does reframe how you look at your own life.
And that brings me to a thought I want to leave you with today. We've talked so much about national resilience, supply chains, and shifting empires. But what about your personal resilience?
It's the ultimate question here.
If the source is right, And the global efficiency machine permanently shut down tomorrow if you woke up and lost access to the cloud, the cheap grocery store food, the easy transport, and you were forced out of your comfortable city. What actual, tangible, physical skill do you possess right now that doesn't require an internet connection, a fragile global supply chain, or a glowing screen?
It is a deeply uncomfortable question, but one that truly tests how prepared we are for the reality this source envisions.
Something to seriously ponder as you go about the rest of your day in this remarkably fragile world. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be right back here next time to unpack another fascinating stack of sources with you. Until then, take care.